So today we're going to be talking about gluten-free diets and irritable bowel syndrome, also referred to as IBS. And as a dietitian who works to help people out who have IBS, I can tell you that something I've seen very commonly amongst the IBS population would be people trying out gluten-free diets, or maybe considering a gluten-free diet for managing IBS-related symptoms. Now, when it comes to what a gluten-free diet is, it's basically just a diet that eliminates gluten, which is a family of proteins found in certain grains like wheat, barley, or rye. And I feel like it's not surprising that there's been a lot of interest from the IBS community in gluten-free diets, because I feel like everyone has been very interested in gluten-free diets since like 2011 onward, where, all of our social media feeds have collectively become gluten-free. QAnon filled with lots of information on gluten-free diets, sometimes accurate information, sometimes maybe not so accurate information. Now, I say that not to diminish this diet strategy in any way whatsoever, because a gluten-free diet is a necessary and validated medical intervention for several types of conditions out there, such as celiac disease or wheat allergy, to name a couple. And also there is a subset of the population which appear to not have these kind of conditions, but still seem to react to something in gluten-containing grains. So this is often referred to either as non-celiac gluten sensitivity or non-celiac wheat sensitivity. Now, when it comes to IBS, hopefully in getting an IBS diagnosis, you have had other kinds of issues like celiac disease or wheat allergy ruled out if you have symptoms indicative of those types of conditions. But in the absence of a medical condition where you absolutely have to restrict gluten, is it possible that people with IBS might have a non-celiac gluten or wheat sensitivity? And the answer to that is yes. It is possible. And there is some evidence out there that quite a bit of people with IBS do seem to respond favorably to a gluten-free diet. But I think the biggest takeaway that you need to have from this video overall is that 8 to 9 times out of 10, it's not actually the gluten. Based off of the research we have, it seems like it's probably something else that commonly co-occurs with gluten and gluten-containing foods. So right off the bat, let's start talking about what the research seems to show when it comes to whether or not a gluten-free diet helps with IBS. Now, I can tell you that in some of the clinical trials that have been done, a vast majority of participants with IBS do seem to respond favorably to a gluten-free diet. And by that, I mean, we've seen upwards of 70 to 80% of participants in these trials responding with reduced IBS symptoms on a gluten-free diet. So that sounds like a very open and closed shut case here, but that's actually not the case, because to make that leap, we're having to make the assumption that it was surely gluten in this diet intervention that was helping to relieve symptoms. But the problem with that assumption is that food is fairly complex and does not often just contain gluten, for instance, in a gluten-containing food. And it's possible that there could be other suspects within these foods that might be contributing to IBS symptoms. So with that, it's much like, let's say you're an investigator and you're looking into a murder mystery, right? And with that, you think that it's the neighbor that was likely the prime suspect. And so you start incriminating the neighbor, but then you fail to look into the creepy spouse, right? And the problem with that is that what if it actually was the spouse, and now this spouse is like out amongst society wreaking havoc? Just like with the diet, if you don't properly isolate what's actually causing symptoms, what if you're encountering similar compounds in your food that are provoking your symptoms elsewhere? And so you've really only addressed those types of compounds in gluten-containing foods that you're now avoiding on a gluten-free diet. So now researchers are like, okay, we've got to pay attention to the crazy spouse. We've got to look into some other suspects here. And so some of the suspects that have been mentioned as, possible suspects are things like amylase trypsin inhibitors or wheat germ lectin. We won't be getting into those today. And also just the possibility, what if we're dealing with some kind of placebo or even a nocebo effect where someone's anticipating harm, from something they believe is gluten containing, even if it's just a placebo, and then they still have harmful effects, which based off of a review that we saw on this topic recently seems to happen upwards of 40% of the time in participants who believe they have non-celiac gluten sensitivity when they're given a placebo. So definitely something that could be at play here. But then I think the primary suspect, which we believe is actually truly the primary suspect in IBS, is fructans, which is a type of carbohydrates that are found in a lot of gluten-containing foods, and also happen to be a type of carbohydrate that we know can provoke IBS symptoms in sensitive individuals. And it's actually something that is restricted as part of a low FODMAP diet, which is a diet therapy aimed at helping people with IBS to manage their symptoms. So what happened from here is that researchers started conducting experiments where they would isolate the effects on people in IBS of fructans or FODMAPs from that of gluten. And so what was found from those trials is that people with suspected non-celiac gluten sensitivity, the numbers of those individuals would dwindle down to as little as 10 to 20% of participants who are believed to have a true gluten sensitivity, leaving 80 to 90% of participants in these trials seemingly having a fructan sensitivity. So that means that the great majority of people seem to be sensitive to the carbohydrate fractions in these gluten-containing foods, not the gluten proteins. Now, when it comes to these ranges, we definitely feel like more studies need to be done, especially ones where there are repeated challenges, because we would like to see that someone that has a gluten intolerance can actually be verified to have a reproducible response, which some studies have called that into question. So we'll see if these ranges kind of hold over time. But that being said, I think the biggest takeaway that needs to be had here is that if you suspect that you have a non-celiac gluten sensitivity in IBS, then it is so much more likely that you have a fructan sensitivity than it is for you to have a true gluten sensitivity. Not to say it's not possible that you could have a gluten sensitivity, but odds are definitely in favor of fructans.
Before we continue, I want to quickly tell you about ibsprobiotics.org. So this started out as a research project, but then we ended up turning it into this really cool comparison tool. When you go on the site, you can easily compare which probiotics were most effective for different IBS symptoms, all exclusively based off of clinical studies. In fact, we spent the past 2 years building it, having analyzed over 50 different probiotics across more than 75 placebo-controlled trials. And the results surprised us. For example, we found that some really popular probiotics were nowhere near as effective as some lesser-known options, and there were even some probiotics that seemed to do more harm than good. So I hope this free tool helps you to cut through the marketing hype and saves you a ton of time when evaluating a probiotic.
So now let's talk a little bit more about some of the pitfalls of a gluten-free diet. And the reason we want to bring this up is because I feel like this diet pattern has just been so glamorized by so many individuals outside of medical context, and has been promoted for so many different things that really there's not a lot of evidence to support its use for. And so I think it's important that we have a little bit of a counterbalance to that. And so I think the first thing that can be a drawback of following a gluten-free diet is that what if you actually have a condition like celiac disease, and then you get on a gluten-free diet, which is a therapy for celiac disease. But the problem with that is that you can't get a diagnosis of celiac disease unless you've been on a gluten-containing diet. And that's essential for having an accurate diagnosis. So that's a really big step that you want to go through if you feel like you're having gluten-related issues or wheat-related issues. Please, 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 please don't take out gluten until you have been screened for celiac disease first. And then next up is that you can run into issues with nutrient deficiencies. So we see that in the literature for individuals that are on long-term gluten-free diets for medical reasons, for instance. And what we find is that it's not uncommon to see things like B vitamin deficiencies, or even iron deficiencies, or calcium deficiencies, even though a lot of these grains aren't even all that high in calcium, but just the way in which we often eat them, where, maybe you have a bowl of cereal with some milk or some sort of calcium fortified milk alternative, then it can start to impact all sorts of different nutrients. So you may not be as well nourished on a gluten-free diet unless you're really careful. And then, of course, quality of life, right? This is a restrictive diet. And so passing up on the garlic knots when you're out with friends at a restaurant or something, that can be hard. It can also be more expensive and start chipping away at your budget a little bit because gluten-free products generally can be more expensive than some other conventional products. And then, of course, there are these potential impacts on the gut microbiome. So why would a gluten-free diet have any sort of impact on the gut microbiome? And it comes back down to the fact that foods are complex, and these gluten-containing foods also contain these compounds that are kind of like prebiotics that can help to stimulate the growth of beneficial bacteria or microbes in our guts. And so when it comes to gluten-containing foods, the fructans that, can provoke symptoms can have prebiotic effects, or there's also compounds like arabinoxyleins, which can be very beneficial. And you start removing those things. And so what happens is that different species or genre of gut microbes start to maybe lessen a little bit more in abundance because they don't have those things to feast on. So in short-term gluten-free diet trials, we actually see a decrease in different gut microbial genres, such as bifidobacterium, lactobacillus, which are generally believed to be beneficial. And then there have also been instances where there have been increased numbers of potentially harmful microbial species and families, such as E. coli and Enterobacteriaceae. And these types of shifts are a bit concerning, leading some to propose that they might even be a setup in the future for an intestinal infection, for instance, which is nothing to disregard, especially in IBS, which can even be provoked, it seems, from a prior infection for some individuals. And then last but not least, but if you're following a gluten-free diet, just because you do that doesn't mean that you're removing all potential irritants, right? And there are some cases where gluten-free products can actually be fairly high in different types of FODMAPs. Those fermentable carbohydrates we restrict on a low FODMAP diet to help gain symptom control in IBS. And I will just give you a personal anecdote here. So it's probably been, I don't know, maybe 2012, I tried a gluten-free diet pre-becoming a dietitian. Human guinea pig here. And I remember getting this gluten-free bar of some sort. I don't know. I can't even remember all that was in it, but it had inulin in it. And I didn't realize that. Oh my gosh, you guys, I couldn't leave the house. I was totally wrecked. So just because something's gluten-free does not automatically mean it's going to be a symptom-free food, right? So I think that's definitely something to keep in mind, all of these different factors when it comes to considering a gluten-free diet in IBS. So now, what do you do if you are someone with IBS who also suspects that they might have either a wheat or gluten sensitivity of some sort? So I think the first thing that you absolutely have to do, non-negotiable, you have to ensure that you are not positive for celiac disease, and you need to be on a gluten-containing diet to be appropriately tested for that. So that is your first step if you haven't already done that as part of your IBS workup. And be sure to not skip that before proceeding onward. And then the next thing is that we would actually not consider starting with a gluten-free diet just based off of our own clinical judgment, because the evidence is pretty clear that you're more likely to be struggling with a fructan issue more so than a gluten issue. So first step would be discussing with your medical provider if you might be appropriate to try out a low FODMAP diet first. And then with that, we will be able to assess, right, if you are fructan sensitive. And so after you do a low FODMAP diet, depending on how that goes for you, if you don't have enough symptom relief and you still are suspecting that you might be running into a gluten kind of issue causing symptoms, then at that point, it might be okay to consider doing a removal of gluten from the diet for about 2 to 6 weeks, followed by a re-challenge down the track, blinded if you can pull that off, maybe by having someone in your family or a close friend helping you with blinding that challenge if possible, because the nocebo response is definitely a major thing. And you may even want to repeat the challenge a few times to get the most accurate approximation of your gluten sensitivity. And then from there, if you do find that you have some level of sensitivity to gluten, it may not be a bad idea to play around with a threshold in which you can tolerate gluten. Do symptoms get provoked after you eat one cracker versus after you eat a whole bowl of pasta, for instance, right? Just because there's really no indication that you would need to be as restrictive as you might need to be if you had something like a wheat allergy or celiac disease, for instance. So those are our suggestions for now. And I know you may want some additional information here as far as how to go about doing those things. And we've been considering that, do we put together some application resources walking you through some of these different steps? If you suspect that maybe you have kind of a gluten issue, or is that really going to be the best bang for our buck, given that most of you probably have a fructan issue, right? So let us know your thoughts as to whether or not that is a type of resource you would be interested in having access to if we were to put that together. And I would love to hear what you have to say about that in the comments below.
Thanks for watching this video. And as a quick reminder, don't forget to check out ibsprobiotics.org. We're really proud of this research project turned comparison tool that we've made. And of course, it is free and publicly available. And if you want to keep up to date with the latest IBS research, you can follow me here. See you next time.